Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Running the Bases. I am Michael Garaffa, joined today by Nick Nath and Ryan Blank, and we will be shortly joined by Spencer Shehawk, who is about to walk in right now. And we also have a very special guest, as you could tell by the title, as Mr. Gary Thorne should be joining us very shortly. He is trying to figure out how to get it working, but how's everybody doing today? Are we having a good one? Nick, we'll start with you. How's your Thursday going?
It's going pretty well. I mean, with all the news this week about how the MLB's making no progress with the MLBPA and how they're now going federally asking the government for money. It's pretty sad in the MLB world, but luckily we have Mr. Gary Thorne to join us today to brighten up our days and maybe give us some hope on what's to come for the MLB season. But yeah, doing pretty good.
Well, let's hope that he sent a message saying that his laptop doesn't support StreamYard somehow. So I don't know what kind of laptop he has, but I told him to try Google Chrome. We'll see if that'll make a difference. If it does, then Gary Thorne will be joining us very shortly. But obviously, we are awaiting him to join us here on this fantastic day. Ryan, how are you doing?
Doing all right. Last night I had a show where we talked about the lockout, everything that's going on, and it's just a mess. And at some point, one side is going to have to not one side, both sides are going to have to realize they're not going to get what they want. They have to meet in the middle. Mm-hmm. Because at this point, spring training, the only way it's happening on time is if it's just minor leaguers. And we're at the point where we are in danger of not having the season start on time.
That's very true.
It's a mess, and it's frustrating because all of us want baseball. Pitchers and catchers are supposed to report very soon.
And we have now the very legendary Mr. Gary Thorne trying to join the stream as we speak. But Gary, how are you? How have things been? We haven't seen you in like 2 months.
Just ducky, using my extreme technological advanced state of mind. I was actually able to download Chrome, get it on the computer, and find out where you guys are. That's the most extensive tech I've ever done.
Well, I'm incredibly proud. And also, I do need to give a warning to any guests that we have on. We are on the air, even though I'm not worried about you swearing, but we do have to be aware that we're not allowed to swear on air. So that's
good.
Just, added bonus. Also, Spencer, your Blaze mic is on, just so you're aware.
All right, yeah.
We do need you in the stream. Yeah, we're trying to get Spencer in. He had to join. He had to come in a little bit late. So, Gary, welcome to the show. We've been dying to have you. We're so happy that we finally made it work. It's been 2 months in the making, but how has life been? I mean, it's been 2 months. You've got
good.
Yeah, well, that's good.
I missed you in class, not seeing uniforms every day of
Well, you got one today. This is an R.A. Dickey shirt, too. So
very good. Good. Yeah.
It was randomly selected from my picker. It picked it. It was perfect. It found itself into the show today. So, Gary.
Let me get in a good word here, if I could. An opportunity. We just lost a really good person by the name of Jeff Innes. Jeff was a pitcher with the New York Mets. He was a middleman, and he was one of the nicest people I've ever met in the game. And I haven't had an opportunity to speak out publicly about it. I really want to say it's somebody I will really miss. It's losing good people is not an easy thing, and Jeff Innes was good people. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. Jeff was I never also personally met him, but you hear the story everyone tells about what Jeff did and what he meant for the Mets specifically. And he was certainly a legendary figure in the Mets fan base and just in general. He was a beloved guy. So it certainly was a very hard loss. We've had a couple tough losses in the last couple months, but it seems to just be happening more and more lately that we're losing some of the greats as they get older. It's
Wait till you get older.
Yeah.
More and more often, believe me.
Yeah, I don't look forward to that, but I mean, we're happy to have you here, and that is all that matters. You are the host of our today. I'm going to put you up top. I'm sorry, Nick, that we're moving you to the bottom of the screen. So we've got Gary in the middle. So a lot of the things we talked about in class were regarding the lockout. When we would talk about baseball, we were anticipating it at that point. Our class ended like the 2 days after the lockout ended, and here we are 2 months later, and nothing. So, what are your thoughts on the lockout right now? I mean, fill us in on what your thoughts have been over the last 2 months.
Well, I was sure there was going to be it was going to be very contentious. There was no question about that. There's always backroom negotiations that are going on and had been going on throughout the past more than a year, actually. They'd engaged in discussions and clearly just were not coming to a point where they could put an agreement together. And so there was no question there was going to be a lockout. And I think we'll miss most of spring training. I don't expect it, maybe have no spring training at all. There are the issues that the key issues are still to be resolved. They revolve largely, as it always does, around money, one way or the other, and the question of when free agency will come into existence. A real problem with the clubs who have been able to hold back started person out in spring training so that he doesn't then bring him up to the majors when he's not going to have a full year of service, which will give the club another year to be able to work with the individual before he's a free agent. That sort of thing really has irked players for a long time. It's a big deal, and it's an issue that I think has put a real hold on what's going on right now. As I always said, as an attorney in negotiations, if it's only about money, we're going to get it done. Money's an issue, but you'll have an answer. Some of these other things I think are even more important. And I think the players over the last CBA had given up a good deal. I think a little more than what they thought they had when it comes to arbitration rights and time periods for service, et cetera, and minimum salaries. And I think they're trying to claw some of that back now. So I think that's part of what's going on with the Players Association. So I think we're in for a while. I think it's going to be a stay. It wouldn't surprise me to see the season get started somewhat on time without a spring training and maybe 2 or 3 weeks of getting the pitchers ready. But as we all know, I mean, they're working now. These athletes work all year long now. So it's the pitcher batter matchup that really is what spring training is all about. And it'll take a little time for that, but we'll see.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that was something that we were talking about a lot in class is that, I mean, there's a high likelihood that spring training doesn't even happen. And it's looking more and more likely by the day. And it's like you said, the ramifications are just going to be so bad for baseball. While, yes, minor leaguers are still getting to have their own somewhat spring training, it's not the same. And those guys really need it. It's going to throw things completely off. Now, the one thing that I'm really happy about it that's going to, that just selfishly as a Mets fan, is that Max Scherzer's first start as the Mets will come in the regular season as opposed to in spring training. And that's going to be the case with a lot of players. So it'll make it for a much more special introduction to the teams when they get in there.
Michael, I would want to disagree with that because the issue is with no spring training, there could be a lot more injuries. You saw guys get hurt when you went from 60 to 162. We could see a lot of injuries because this is where they really get ramped up, get that batter pitcher practice and reps, and we could end up losing that. So honestly, I'd be really worried about my pitchers, especially when there's potentially no spring training for them.
And I know baseball is different, but I remember when the NFL canceled their preseason, and we saw like within the first 3 weeks, like we had 10 or 15 superstars out with season-ending injuries. So it just goes to show you how important like getting those reps in early in the season is. So if there's no spring training, we could be in for a long season.
Exactly. I think the craziest thing about all this, and Gary, I'm wondering how you feel about this.
Oops. So sorry. I muted your mic, Spencer. Go ahead.
It's now 3 years of not regular type spring training. It's either the pandemic's either shut it down, there hasn't been any, or it was this kind of alternate style to it. And just for you, how different is that from past years, and how do you see that kind of changing baseball?
Yeah, I mean, it's so entirely different. You don't get that gradual progression of players, especially the pitchers, and getting ready for a season and you get all the spring training stories and the battles, so-called, for positions. Although there's really not much of that left anymore. Teams know going into spring training who's going to be on the roster and who isn't, except maybe for the final 2 spots. That's already been decided by the contracts that have been entered into. But certainly, it's the pitchers that everybody worries about. And it is about the injuries, about them being able to get ready, not be injured early on in the season. And pitchers will always tell you, and the hitters the same thing. You can go through practices all winter long and all spring long on your own in a batting cage with a pitching machine, throwing to your friends or throwing to teammates. It's not the same as when you go into a competitive game situation. You do jack it up a little more as a pitcher. As a hitter, the focus, you've got to learn how to focus again, which you haven't done no matter how hard you've tried. The competitiveness is different. So that's why the spring training matters. But you do worry about injuries. You do worry about pitchers getting ready. And what you end up doing, and we've seen this before now because of COVID, it's changed the whole face of the game pitching-wise. COVID's one of the reasons why we've gotten away from starting pitchers. I mean, they were doing that in Florida well before COVID, but COVID just moved all that along because now we've got guys who aren't ready to come out and go 7 innings in a ball game. So you're planning to have a guy go 4 or 5 and then another 2 and a 2 and whatever you can get down at the end. That's changed the whole face of the game. And that teams are now building themselves that way, as you know. And if we have another lockout and go into the season with a very short or no spring training, we're going to see even more of that. We're going to see the pitchers who are, usually out of the bullpen come in and work as starters.
Yeah, I don't remember the last time starting pitcher won a full game in the postseason. Like that, it's been forever, I feel like, since we've seen like managers give starting pitchers like that full trust. I mean, and it is concern for injury, but I feel like in the postseason too, when you need that guy and when your bullpen's depleted, they have to go like 8 or 9. We just don't see that anymore, I feel like.
No, the whole game has changed in that regard, and I don't see it going back to the starting pitcher who goes. The starting pitchers who used to say, I go out to complete a game, and who never wanted to be pulled out of the game, that day is long gone.
I wouldn't be shocked if the last complete game in the postseason was Madison Bumgarner in the 2016 wild card. It really wouldn't shock me. I can't think of any since. I mean, that one obviously stands out to me, but I mean,
you can research that for your next broadcast.
I can. And Spencer and Ryman, you guys do talk because the audio is going through Nick's mic. Just talk a little louder because then this way, because I'm hearing it come through the.
Louder?
Yeah, yes, that was perfect. That volume was great.
Okay, now this is weird. I've never been told I need to be louder.
My ears might hurt after this.
Yeah. Well, Ryan's pretty much okay.
Too, but Gary, I do have a question for you. So, with how COVID has impacted pitching, did you see this happening where you're going to see less guys going the distance in games before COVID had that impact because of injuries and really just the training going from adding 102 games from one season to another?
Did I see that coming? The situation like has happened in Florida where you're using these? Yeah. I'm not going to say I saw it coming, but in doing games when Florida first started doing this, when Tampa Bay started doing this, there was no question that other teams were taking a long look at it. Because the fact of the matter is, because of expansion, there aren't enough players. There aren't enough players, period. And there certainly aren't enough pitchers. When you have to go out and fill all these teams up for these long seasons, there's not enough talent out there to do it with the likes of starting pitchers that can go 7 or 8 or 9 innings in a ball game. So it was out of necessity that it happened. And then other clubs saw it could be successful and also maybe cut down on salaries. You weren't going to pay, like the Kershaws of the world who still exist. There aren't many of them. You weren't going to have to pay that kind of money to pitchers who were starting ball games for you. And you could use a number of pitchers and the up and down. Look how much we've seen during the course of a season of players, especially pitchers, going up and down between the minors, the AAA ball club usually, and the major league team. You bring a guy up, he pitches 3 innings. The next day he goes down. You bring another guy up to work out of the bullpen. You send him down. You bring another guy up to start a game. I mean, that's become the norm. And that's also part of the CBA as to how much of that should be going on, because it obviously cuts into service time for these players who are continually going up and down between the minors and the major league team. And so it saves money for the clubs. So, I mean, I'm not going to say I saw it coming, but once Tampa Bay started doing it, there was no question other clubs were going to follow suit.
So now you mentioned the CBA, and obviously this is a very big discussion in baseball, the lockout and everything going on. So what are your personal thoughts on the conversations that are being had? Do you think that you think maybe one side's a little bit more hard-headed than the other? Or?
Number one, we have no idea what's going on. Don't think that what you're reading is what's going on. You're only getting the very tip of the iceberg. And understandably so. These negotiations go on more often than is reported. They are the old backdoor, backroom discussions that are taking place between the players and the owners and their representatives. There's lots more of it than what we get to hear about, because neither side wants to have what they're asking for put out publicly for fear of not being able to get it and then looking like they've lost the battle. So what both sides prefer to do is to have private negotiations going on, and only when they get to the agreement do they want to be able to go out publicly with it and be able to have a joint press conference and a joint statement made about the CBA. So there's a lot more going on. But having said that, the highlighted issues that we are hearing about are real. They are real because what that usually comes from players who are part of the negotiating team who know what's going on at these private meetings. And they tend to leak out more stories than the owner's side does. One side being harder than the other? No, I don't think so. I mean, they both got their nose to the grindstone here. They're both after as much as they can get into this CBA, because it probably will be an extended CBA. Both sides don't want to have to go through this over and over and over. So they try and get a CBA done that's got clauses that will move along with the years. So I don't think one's harsher than the other.
Now, Nick, you haven't gotten to ask a question yet, so we'll throw it to you now. Gary, we only have this hour, so we could talk to you for days, but we've got to squeeze in everything we can for this 1 hour. And hopefully, maybe sometime after the show, we can have you back on again to keep
when
on
playing ball again. That would be good.
That would be great. We would love.
Come on, Nick. What do you got?
I'll go away from the negativity a little bit here. I meant to ask you this while we were in class, but I never got to it. What's your most favorite call you've ever made, you'd say?
Oh, Lord.
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah,
I like that.
I always wanted to ask.
Yeah, that's always a hard question.
Personally, for me, your bowling call is definitely
That's probably my favorite call, my bowling call. Yes.
Yeah, that's your favorite call?
Elite call.
Yeah, come on. I love that call.
That's an awesome call.
It's the most, I will say it is the most unusual history to a call that I've ever had. The fact that it comes up every year on the anniversary of the day never ceases to amaze me. And the thing shows up on YouTube, and it's crazy. I don't know. There were too many to name one. I mean, you got, in hockey, it's a lot of the Gretzky goals that I was able to do, the records that he broke. It was a great series between Colorado and Detroit in the Stanley Cup playoffs there, where they went at one another for a few years in a row, where the games were just spectacular. The 86 World Series with the Mets, where I was broadcasting radio with Bob Murphy and getting to do all of that season. I'll never have another season like that. Because Bob and I did every single game in 1986, every spring training game, the travel game back up to New York where we stopped in Washington to play in the snow, and then every single regular season game and every single postseason game. Wow. It was unbelievable. And they had a great season, and the games were tremendous. So that whole season is, I've always said, I think I started at the top and went down from there, because trying to equal the kind of excitement that came in that 86 season, almost impossible to do. But those are some of the calls that I remember and that I really enjoyed. The Rangers winning the cup and the guy holding up the sign, I can finally die in peace. I thought told the whole story for Ranger fans when they won that in '94. So those are some of them. I mean, there were just too many really, and to pick one out and say that that's the one, I don't think I can do it.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But bowling
All
would be right there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely like a top 5 call ever for me. Like that was so iconic.
That's been in like rap music too. Like that's all
Yeah,
over
the
place.
remixes. That's so cool.
So, go ahead, Ryan.
And with all, like you said, you did every single game in that 1986 season, and you've done so much traveling around the country and all over for different games. What would you say is your favorite venue that you have called a game at?
Oh, well, I guess for a number of reasons, the favorite venue would have to be Fenway Park, but a lot of that goes back to being a kid. I grew up in Maine, so the Red Sox were the team that I cheered for in the days of Ted Williams, and Fenway Park was the first ballpark I ever went to see a Major League Baseball game. So, those things are very special and stay with you forever. And then I've always been a fan of the Red Sox, following the Red Sox just by the nature of where I grew up and who I was associated with, and knowing the announcers there in Boston as I do. And I love Fenway. I mean, I really enjoy doing games there. I love Wrigley. I love the old ballparks. Wrigley's a great place to do a game. It's not that it's comfortable or pleasant or you get great lines of sight. It's the history. It's the fact that you're sitting there in these ballparks that have been around for 100 years, and you think of all of the games that have been played there and all the people who played in those ballparks, and you just kind of shake your head. You're just thankful that you've had an opportunity to do games in those places. Camden Yards and doing the Orioles, was as good a ballpark comfortably and equipped to handle announcers as any ballpark still. It's a great place to broadcast. You're right behind home plate. You're at the second level. You got a clear view. There's nothing in the way. You got a big booth. Everything about it was ideal. I love doing games. I love doing games there at Camden Yards. But the older ballparks I really loved. I miss hockey's the same thing. I mean, you guys are even too young to remember what we called the old barns, because that's exactly what they were. In Boston, to play at the Garden, it was just cramped, hot, sticky. You had trouble walking because of all the beer and the gum and everything on the floor. But man, when the game got started, right on top of it. Chicago Stadium was unbelievable. It was a barn. Everything went right straight up, and the ice was down low. And the fans, it was so impressive to me. When I knew they were going to close Chicago Stadium, my daughter at the time was younger, 10 or 11. I took her to Chicago Stadium because I wanted her to know what that was like. I wanted her to feel what went on during a hockey game at Chicago Stadium, and especially the national anthem. If you guys have ever seen what that looks like, at Chicago Stadium, when the national anthem started, everybody stood up and roared. The entire anthem just roared. The building shook. The hair came up on your arms and the back of your neck because it was unbelievable. It was the only place that happened at. And St. Louis had an old barn, literally, that they played in. And they played a tough brand of hockey. It was a brawling game. And you felt as though the building was perfect for it. It was like you were in some sleaze bar somewhere where guys were getting into a fight all the time. That's what it felt like when you were in there doing a game. And the broadcast booths in these places, you were right on top of the ice. You were in the crowd, and you were right on top of the ice. At the old Boston Garden, you could lean over. You stand up. You only had like a table and a couple of chairs. That was your broadcast booth. You could stand up and lean over and talk to the guys on the ice in your normal voice during their warm-ups. You'd holler down, "Hey, Peter, how you doing?" And they'd talk to you, and the same thing in St. Louis. So I miss those old barns. There was just something going on in those places that was a show in and of itself.
That's super cool.
I agree. It's also, I'm getting like starstruck because we're hearing things. We've had guests on the show, but none have had quite the experience or the history that you've had, and that's why it's just like it's so cool for us to not only get to have had an entire class with you, but to have you on the show. We're so lucky to have gotten to have this experience.
You get to ask the questions instead of me now.
I know, right? This is great. The narrative's changed. So I've got question regarding the Mets and that '86 World Series. No, it's not a big one. It's just the '86 World
You're
Series.
like, of course you bring up the Mets, but 86, that's okay. I thought you were going to bring up something now. I'm like, dude,
No.
let's get into the season at least.
Yeah. So in that '86 World Series, you told us you had the pleasure of being on the call for the entire series. In the Bill Buckner moment, which is obviously the biggest highlight, as a broadcaster and then just as a baseball fan, what was going through your mind while that's happening?
Well, it was surreal because you couldn't believe what you were seeing. Bob Murphy and I had been doing the games, and at that point, and I remember succinctly, I had already picked up something I was using in the broadcast, and had put it in my bag on the side. I'd started packing up. The Mets were going to lose. That infamous flash that came up on the scoreboard at Shea Stadium. Congratulations, world champion Red Sox. Whatever it said, accidentally before the game was over, it showed up.
No way.
And then
No.
and then quickly went away. I mean, the game was over. And the crowd, there were 55,000, I think, that night, and sounded like a tomb. They were waiting. They were waiting for the end, and then that happened, and you just couldn't believe it. I mean, we're looking at it like the ball goes between his legs. Here comes Ray Knight around third, and his arms going up in the air and crossing the plate, and it was just all surreal. And then I guess both a broadcaster and a fan, at that point, I really think we all said they're going to win the World Series. They're going to win the World Series. I don't believe in fate, but something was going on because that ball should have been handled. Out should have been made. Game over. Red Sox win. And when that didn't happen, we talk about momentum in sports. There couldn't be a much bigger momentum change in a sporting event than that one was. When that ball went through, everything flipped from that moment on, including going into Game 7, which people forget about, when the Mets fell behind again and had to come back to win. It didn't matter. Momentum had shifted inexorably to the Mets' favor for the rest of that night and for Game 7. It was, it was just really hard to believe. That's the way we felt. We were looking like, would we really see this? Did this really happen? And we kept looking at the replays on the TV monitors, like, how the hell did that ball go through? How could he not have caught it? And I don't blame Bill. I mean, I've always felt so bad because Buckner was such a really good ball player, and forever he's had to live with this as the only thing that a lot of people know about him, and that's really tough. But fortunately, he and Mookie Wilson, who hit the ball, they obviously came together. They've been on tour together. They go on speaking engagements together. That's good. I mean, that's nice. That brings Bill back a little bit and can do something with it that's positive.
So we'll throw it over Spencer. You also haven't had a question in a bit, so I'll shift the conversation back over your way.
Yeah, I was just thinking, so many seasons, and when you see so many guys play, is there someone that maybe you saw play that necessarily didn't jump out either on the stats or just now, X years later, kind of just they aren't really someone that gets talked about a lot? Who's that player for you?
There are a number of those guys. A lot of people don't get enough credit, especially on good teams, because they're overshadowed by the bigger stars. I'll tell you, there is one name that comes to mind, and I've used it talking about, and we're going back to the '86 Mets. Who was their shortstop? His name was Rafael Santana.
Wow.
Never hear about him. Never hear a word about him. Rafi got overshadowed by Keith and Gary and Ray and everybody else, and Lenny Dykstra and everybody else on that team, starting pitching and everything. He was bedrock at short. I mean, he was an outstanding defensive player and a good hitter in the sense that he had good at bats. He wasn't going to bat for a high average. He wasn't going to hit home runs, but he was a steady guy at the plate who gave you a good at bat, even if he made an out. He worked the pitcher. But at shortstop, he was tremendous. He was just tremendous. he was the linchpin in an infield that bounced around a little bit. I mean, Keith obviously at first base was recognized as probably the star of the infield, even though Ray won the MVP award in the World Series. But Keith was the better known, but a lot of that came from his work at the plate, where he was a tremendous hitter, and his work at first base. I mean, he's the best first baseman I've ever seen play. And I think, unfortunately, he's not had consideration for the Hall of Fame, which I think he really deserves because of his defensive style. But Rafael Santana is one of those people. Rafi, and you'd say that even the Mets fans, they wouldn't have a clue who Rafael Santana was, but he was a key part of that team and didn't get recognized.
I'm going to try something here. I think I can make you full screen if I do this. Let's see.
While you try that, yeah, you mentioned Hall of Fame. That happened
There it is.
a couple weeks
I was
ago.
waiting for this to come up. There it is.
Why'd you want to do that?
Well
A
known.
bad face up there.
Just Bonds and Clemens not making it. Was that the right move, or do you think the whole mistake?
That was the right move. The Hall of Fame still has character as a term in the definition of those who should get to the Hall. If you cheat, I think that affects your character, and I don't think you should be in the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame is composed of two distinct parts physically. There is the Hall of Fame where the plaques are. There's the Hall of Fame that's a museum. Their baseball days and what they did will be recognized in the museum, but are they deserving of having a plaque up in the hall? I don't think so. And I say that having worked at the hall, having been the MC for Sunday intro. There are a number of players who I talked with, older players, who said to me, who's going to protect those of us who tried to play the game right and didn't cheat? Who's going to protect our numbers, our stats, and what we tried to do? And I find real credence in that argument. And I think they get protected by the ballots, by the writers who vote, who recognize that character does matter and cheating impacts on character. No matter how good, there is no question about Bonds being a great baseball player and Clemens being a great pitcher. There's no question about that. But the argument of what they would have done if they in fact used performance enhancing drugs, if they did, how much of an effect did it have on their play and on their careers and on their numbers if in fact that happened? I think that's a legitimate consideration. And I think protecting the guys who tried to play the game right is important.
So now my question, going off of that, is that there's the speculation that Bonds started using the steroids in 2001. And I'm currently doing a story on this for Cronkite Sports. So I've got all the research. And before that time, Bonds had still 500 home runs, over 2,000 hits, and hit 286. So do you think that if 2001 was when he started using steroids, even if he had gotten caught, that just for the time before that he deserves to be in, or it's just because he cheated even after he was a great player that he doesn't deserve it?
Well, I think the cheating after matters and is a factor that can't be taken out of consideration. How long had he played? I don't remember. How long had he played?
86. So he was in the league for about 15 years before supposedly doing steroids.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it. You can look at it that way, but for all Hall of Fame consideration, you always look at a whole career. I mean, you can't start breaking down careers and say, well, this guy for 5, 6, 10 years, 10 years, he hit 301. And then for the last 6 years of his career, he hit 220. That's not a Hall of Fame player. Longevity is a part of it, and tremendous performance, including the longevity, they go together. So I don't think you can break down a career for Bonds or anybody else and say, well, this half was good enough and that you put him in. It's got to be the whole package.
I was hoping someone would ask about the Hall of Fame. So I was really intrigued to hear what you have to say on it. You're the first person I've spoken to in the baseball world that has said no. I talked to Dustin Pedroia this weekend. I talked to former baseball players, current baseball players, and they all say that he deserves to be in. So I'm glad that we have a counter argument here, because I've been waiting.
Who was it who put up? I read an article. Gosh, someone wrote an article, I think, and I don't know where it was. USA Today, maybe, or The Athletic.
I think I know the one you're talking about. I didn't get the link for it, but someone did a really great article on why they say.
Yeah, it was a really good article. It was Glanville, Doug Glanville.
Yeah, that's the one.
Doug did the article, and it's a really good article. It's saying the same kinds of things that I'm saying, only it's coming from a former player.
Yeah.
Who I thought the article was outstanding.
Yeah, that's it's definitely been a hot topic lately. It's
going to be. I mean, A-Rod's next.
Yep.
We're going to go through a whole series of these where the considerations and arguments are going to be the same as we've gone through here. So it's not over. It's not over.
And what do you think about David Ortiz as someone who did get voted in and was also accused of having done steroids?
Well, that's the difference between accused and knowing that they did. If they had admitted to it or had been found to have used officially, that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to be accused of it, I think that's a different story. That one's much tougher. There are a lot of people around baseball, who believed Ortiz did use performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, looking at the difference in his size and the difference in his play from Minnesota to Boston. He said he never did. And there was no other, I believe there was one test that was positive.
One test, and it wasn't supposed to even be made public or used as an official test.
Exactly. Yeah. So you didn't have, if that being true, then you had nothing in the way of evidence to say that he had used performance-enhancing drugs or steroids. You didn't have anything. So I think in that case, how are you going to say no? On that basis, you're going to look at his numbers and you're going to vote for what he did.
Okay, I'm going to switch the topic to another topic that happened a few weeks ago. Ken Rosenthal and how he was fired by MLB Network. What do you think about that?
Oh, we talked about so much when you guys were in class. I think there's a growing push on broadcasters at both the national and local levels to conform to what the teams want said. It largely has happened because in most cases now, the broadcasters are employed by the team. They're the ones that sign the checks. Some are still employed by the media outlets, but not a lot. Your national broadcasters, of course, are different, but for local team broadcasters, there's a push against them. And I think that push now is expanded to even those who are doing the national level stuff, where those at the upper levels of control in the corporate world who are running these organizations are saying do this or don't do this. And if in fact you don't comply, the ramifications can be that you're going to lose your position. And I think that's just an example of it. He handled it, I thought, extremely well, not backbiting and not saying he wouldn't continue to report what he believed was important to report. But it gets tougher and tougher, I think, to do that because you're weighing your career and what's going to happen to it if you don't comply.
Yeah, that's a really great topic. Now I've got Nick. I want you to go first before I do because you haven't asked questions a bit. So,
Gary, I'm so curious. This is looking at a two-parter. In your opinion, who is the greatest baseball player of all time, and who is the greatest player you've ever seen live?
Oh my God. Well, again, I go back to my roots. Ted Williams was probably the greatest hitter that I've ever seen. And as a youngster, I did get to see him play a lot.
That's so cool.
and I actually worked with Ted when I went to the Mets and was broadcasting. Davey Johnson was a good friend of Ted's. Ted had signed on to a new card company that was putting out his name. They needed someone to travel with him in New York for public appearances and promoting the card company, etc. And Davey got me hooked up with it, and so I traveled with Ted, doing some of these promotional things. That was great. Where I really got to. I'm not going to say we didn't become close friends or anything, but I really got to see him as he was off the field and out of the public eye at times. So I thought that was the greatest hitter. Where the greatest players is just, it's so hard because in my mind as a baseball fan, I'm looking at all of the five-tool player. Who's the best? Who's the five-tool player in the game? And we don't do that much anymore because we've become like everything else in society, specific to, you're not just a doctor. You're doing something else. You're doing a specialty within that framework. And the same thing's true in sports now. Everybody's got a specialty. There's no question DiMaggio, who I didn't get to see play a lot, except on television a little. DiMaggio was a great five-tool player. I mean, Mickey Mantle, prior to the knee injury, was a tremendous five-tool player. He had such tremendous speed, great arm, defensive player, and obviously a tremendous hitter, both for average and for home runs. Watching, my former partner, Jim Palmer, pitch, I mean, Jimmy put up some unbelievable numbers that are going to be very hard to replicate. My dear friend, Tom Seaver, the late great, I got to see him at the end of his career. Tom competitively was as tough as anybody who ever played the game. And as a pitcher, had every nuance covered. He was a baseball intellect when it came to pitching. He didn't just throw the baseball. He threw it for a reason, to a spot for a reason, at a speed for a reason, with a spin for a reason. I mean, he was just so good at his craft. So those are the kind of players I look to. I look to see those who have really excelled in the job that they have done. And Joe Morgan was somebody I always admired. Joe had tremendous talents in the 5-2 field, and I always respected that. So those are the guys I look for. I think it's very hard anymore to say who the greatest is. It's hard because of the time frames they played in, but even harder because of specialties. It's like the DHs, like Ortiz getting into the Hall of Fame. I mean, a few years ago, there was the argument about should a DH ever make the Hall of Fame because he's doing just one thing. Edgar Martinez kind of changed that argument around. And Joe Morgan and I used to talk about this, and Joe would say, if there is a position and they're asked to do it, a job they're asked to do, and they do it better than anybody else in the game, then they should have recognition for doing that job. So I think that's fair, and I think that's how we're going to be judging players in baseball now for forever. It's what were they asked to do and how well they do it.
I agree. So my question is more of just for you to elaborate on something. We spoke about it a lot in class, about how remote broadcasting for away games completely is changing how play-by-play is going and how sports are going. But obviously the viewers don't know what you've had to say on that. So what do you think is the future of baseball play-by-play and sports broadcasting, specifically as it comes with the road games and the ability to do things like that?
Well, let's start with the Olympics that start tomorrow. I mean, look what's going on there. Who would have thought that virtually all of the Olympic events to be covered on NBC will be broadcast by guys sitting in Stamford, Connecticut, or New York City, or over in New Jersey? That's what's going to happen. Who would have thought we would have been doing baseball games off a monitor in an empty ballpark, as I did when I did the Mets last year? The Mets are playing in Philadelphia. I'm sitting at Citi Field, doing the baseball game in an empty ballpark in a booth with Keith Hernandez and I. I mean, who would have thought that was going to happen? And as I've said in the class, I said this, and I continue to say it to broadcasters, look, you people are doing too good a job. People don't even realize you're not at the ballpark. You're doing the game so well that they think you are there, or it doesn't matter that you're there. You're still getting the game done and calling it appropriately. So we may be our own worst enemies in that regard. And I don't think there'll be teams put back on the road, broadcasters put back on the road, but it's going to be less of that. There's going to be more of the broadcasting out of a booth or an empty ballpark. It saves money. Look, the cost of sending people on the road to do games, if you can do the same thing or pretty close to it without spending that money and holding them back in the studio somewhere, then why not do that? And that's, I think, the decision that's being made by teams and broadcast networks. And I think we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Twilight Zone.
Nick, you can leave your mic muted while Spencer does that.
I was
Okay,
I was just
trying to do it from the same room, and we can't leave our things on, or else it's gonna. Yeah.
Keep your mic on.
okay. He said keep it off. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Guys, Spencer had already done it, but whatever. Just go ahead.
radio. To get back on point here about what you're saying, I found it interesting that even during the pandemic, initially it was the radio broadcasters that were being sent out to games still, and I know radio's not a dying form of broadcasting, but it's not as prevalent as it once was. What do you think that letting the radio broadcasters go out kind of does for that medium and maybe makes it more prevalent?
Like the radio guys are going, number one is cheaper. Because if you're doing TV, you got to send you should send the producer and the director and probably one other person out with the broadcast crew in order to have a proper production. It's just easier to do the radio games as far as production's concerned and with fewer people. So it costs less. So you can get the radio people out on the road. I think that's the primary reason why that's being done. And we talked earlier, simulcasting was mentioned. Why not have more simulcasting? If you don't want to send everybody out on the road, you can send either the radio or the TV crew and have them simulcast the game. They do the broadcast. It goes to both radio and TV. We're seeing that in the production elements of the game. And we're going to see more of this, a lot more of this, where instead of we're doing the ballpark, we're doing a game, the Orioles are playing in Boston. So why not have the Boston TV crew's broadcast be the only one? Why do we have both cameramen, audio people, the truck, everybody in Boston to do both, the one for the Red Sox and one for the Orioles? Why not just have one? That's a huge cost savings. And that's exactly what's happening. They're called world feeds. They're neutral feeds, where they're just covering the game, not from the aspect of the Red Sox or the Orioles, but just the game. And both broadcast groups work off the same feed. We're going to see a ton of that going on. And if you can do that, well, then do we really have to send a broadcast crew out there for both radio and television? Or can we hold them both back and have them do it from Baltimore when the game's in Boston? Or alternatively, send one out and do a simulcast? Those are the issues that are being continually discussed now in the broadcast business, and not just for baseball. This is going to go on for all sports. It's a tremendous change in the way we think about broadcasting games, and we're not nearly done with what this is finally going to look like.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's certainly a cost saver, that's for sure. Does anyone have any other questions? Because we've only got a couple of minutes left here on the show before we have to, unfortunately, end it off. But Spencer?
I got a goofy question. If you're in the room right now in that CBA, you could change one rule about baseball one thing about baseball, what would you change and why?
Oh my gosh.
We're hitting with this today.
One rule change about the game. Commercials could only be 1:30.
Oh, wow.
And you can only put up one in-game. You know these 30-second spots we're seeing often.
Yeah.
Well, somebody's injured, and so we'll be back in 30 seconds after this from Progressive. And then the screen divides. You see what's going on the field, and there's a Progressive commercial on the other side. I'd only have 1:30 for commercials during the breaks, and you could only use one of those 30-second in-game spots, I don't know, per every 3 inning or every quarter or something. Figure out some time frame.
That is,
And the reason I say that if for baseball in particular, you got to get this game moving.
yeah,
And the one thing we never talk about is the fact it doesn't move is commercial time.
yeah, that's true.
You're sitting at the ballpark watching a game. We all know, we see it. The players don't even, the third out is made. The players who have to go to the field on defense are all sitting on the bench, and they stay there because there's so much commercial time. They don't have to go out. They don't want to go out. They don't need to go out. They just sit there. So trying to get the game flow to the pace where the players want it to be, where they can do it, and they can, I think would really make the game a better game and more interesting.
That is the ultimate broadcaster answer for sure as well.
Give me time out. Give me time out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
One more question, if that's okay, Michael.
Of course.
Okay. You mentioned how the game is today, so I gotta ask, what is your stance on the idea of robot?
Oh, I was going to ask that too.
Robot umpiring?
Yep.
I would rather see the human element stay in the game and the umpires continue to umpire, make mistakes, have differences, have different ball strike zones. I'd rather see that because I think it's a fun part of the game. I know it's harder on the players. The other thing with the robotics, which I love, is what they discovered about the ball that bounces in front of home plate and comes up into the catcher and it's a strike. I mean, I don't want to be a home plate umpire anymore. You mean you're going to have the bug in your ear. You're going to have to make the call based on what's relayed to you from what the robotic call was. So we still got the umpire there, but the umpire is having to wait. You know, the robot said strike, and then the umpire can go strike. But if the umpire disagrees, the umpire can overrule the robot at this point. That's the way we're going to start with this. And that's a mess. I mean, that's just a mess. But you got to do it because the robotics can pick up the wrong thing, like the bouncing ball that goes into the catcher's glove. I'd rather see the human element involved, but hey, we're going to see robots, so see what happens.
Another thing that we're going to definitely see soon that I'm intrigued to hear your take on it too is the universal DH. What's your thought?
Universal DH, I agree with, but I agree with it, I think, for a different reason. What we were talking about with pitchers, you cannot have pitchers hitting or running the bases. You just
Not
can't.
anymore.
I've seen so many guys at the plate, you know, and they're brought up there to stand there. For one thing, that is what we're going to. They just stand there.
Yeah.
The guys who do try and swing, inevitably during the season, we've got injuries where the ball is hitting the hand. We know a lot of pitchers hit on the other side of the plate so that the top hand isn't the hand they throw with, even though that's not their natural hitting side of the plate. I mean, this is nonsense. I mean, get them out of there. They can't hit. We don't need them in there, standing there taking pitches. Just get them out of there. I'm as traditional as anybody when it comes to the game of baseball, but this has just gone too far. Get the DH in there and let it be for both leagues.
I mean, Jacob deGrom's season was over because of that. He got hurt.
Yeah, every year somebody has that happen to them. Yep.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, Gary, that's going to be it for our time today here on Blaze Radio and on Running the Bases. It was awesome to have you, maybe for just the first time. We, again, hope to possibly have you back sometime in the near future if you're all right with that. Love to have you. It has been a great time. Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary.
So much.
Great seeing you guys again.
Yes.
I was ready to give you a reading assignment or something, but
shoot us an email. I don't think we'll.
Spencer's week this time.
yeah, that's what I'll do.
Yes. No, Gary, you hit the leave studio on the bottom. That's how you find your way out. I appreciate
You
it
got
so
it.
much. Have a
Thanks
great
very
day.
much.
Thank you
I
so
really
much.
appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank